This is our daughter Serena. She cleans office buildings. My mother told the country club crowd, her voice dripping with practiced embarrassment. Dad quickly added, but our son Marcus just made partner at his firm. That's when 3 black SUVs pulled into the circular driveway. The Secret Service agent who entered whispered urgently in my ear, Director Thompson, the president needs you back immediately. The summit's been moved up. The champagne glass slipped from my mother's hand as she realized her janitor daughter was actually the youngest national security advisor in U.S. history. The Westmont Country Club had never seen vehicles like these, black, armored Suburbans with government plates and tinted windows so dark they seemed to absorb light. They rolled up the manicured driveway like storm clouds, past the valet station where teenage boys in bow ties stood frozen, keys dangling uselessly from their hands. I'd been standing by the dessert table, invisible as always at my parents' gatherings, when Agent Harrison entered. 6'4", earpiece visible, hand hovering near his concealed weapon. Everything about him screamed federal authority. The string quartet stopped mid-note. "Ma'am," he said quietly, but in the sudden silence, everyone heard. "We have a situation." My mother, Patricia Thompson, stood frozen in her St. John's suit, the champagne flute tilting dangerously in her manicured hand. My father, District Judge William Thompson, had been mid-story about Marcus's latest courtroom victory when his mouth simply stopped moving. 5 minutes, I told Harrison, my voice carrying a different authority than the apologetic tone I'd been using all evening. "Brief me in the car." "Director Thompson," he said, and I saw my father flinch at the title. "The president insists." 5 minutes, Harrison. The entire country club, 200 of Connecticut's elite, stood in absolute silence, watching their evening's entertainment transform into something from a political thriller. My brother Marcus, the newly minted law partner they'd been celebrating alongside their anniversary, looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. I should explain how I got here. Or rather, how they got here, to this moment of public revelation, after 7 years of deliberate deception on their part and careful silence on mine. 7 years ago, I was recruited out of Yale's political science program by the CIA. Not for my grades, though they were perfect, or my language skills, though I spoke 6 fluently. They recruited me for my ability to see patterns others missed, to predict political movements before they happened, to understand the hidden currents that moved nations toward war or peace. My parents never knew. When I told them I was taking a job with the government, my mother had laughed. "Doing what, sweetheart?" "Filing papers." When I couldn't provide details due to security clearance, they assumed the worst, that I was a low-level bureaucrat, too embarrassed to admit my Ivy League education had led nowhere. The fiction grew over time. When I missed Thanksgiving because I was in Syria identifying terrorist cells, they told everyone I was working overtime at the office building. When I couldn't make Christmas because I was briefing NATO commanders on Russian troop movements, they explained I couldn't afford the flight home. And when I moved to a modest apartment in Arlington instead of a Georgetown townhouse, they assumed I was struggling financially. I let them believe it. It was easier than explaining that my modest apartment was a cover, that my real residence was a secure facility, that the woman they'd raised to be a lawyer's wife was instead predicting and preventing international conflicts. The transition from CIA analyst to national security advisor had happened 18 months ago, when my report on Chinese expansion in the South China Sea had landed on the president's desk. He'd asked to meet the analyst who'd predicted, down to the day, when Beijing would make their move. 2 hours later, I was the youngest person ever appointed to the position. My parents didn't know. How could they? They'd never asked what I actually did, never wondered why I could only communicate through specific channels, never questioned why I sometimes disappeared for weeks. They'd created a story, their daughter, the office cleaner, and stuck to it with remarkable dedication. Tonight was their 35th anniversary. I'd received special permission to attend, though 2 Secret Service agents had been stationed outside since I'd arrived. I'd worn a simple black dress, nothing that would draw attention, and I'd smiled politely while they introduced Marcus's achievements to everyone who would listen. Marcus just won the Pennington case. My father had boasted to Judge Harrison and his wife. Youngest partner in the firm's history. "And Serena?" Mrs. Harrison had asked politely, noticing me standing nearby. That's when my mother had delivered the line about cleaning office buildings, her tone suggesting this was a burden she bore with grace. "Someone has to do those jobs," she'd added with a martyred smile. Now, standing in their country club with 300 eyes on me and Agent Harrison waiting for orders, I pulled out my secure phone. The screen showed 17 missed calls from the Situation Room. Director Thompson. The president's voice came through immediately. The Beijing summit's been moved up. President Chen is already in the air. We need you at Andrews in 20 minutes. Understood, Mr. President. I'm en route. And Director? Good work on the Tehran predictions. You saved lives today. Thank you, sir. I ended the call and looked around the room. My parents' friends, judges, lawyers, doctors, the Connecticut elite, were staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Mrs. Vanderbilt, who'd spent the evening telling everyone about her daughter's charity work, was clutching her pearls so hard I thought they might burst. I need to go, I said to my parents, who still hadn't moved. Serena, my mother's voice was barely a whisper. What is happening? I looked at her, this woman who'd spent 7 years telling everyone her daughter was a failure, who'd used my supposed career as a punchline at dinner parties, who'd actually suggested I marry Marcus's colleague for financial stability. What's happening is that I have to fly to Beijing to prevent a nuclear standoff in the Taiwan Strait, I said calmly. The summit we've been planning for 6 months has been compromised, and if I don't get there before President Chen lands, we could be looking at World War III. But you clean buildings, my father said weakly. No, Dad. I analyze global threats, coordinate international intelligence, and advise the President of the United States on matters of national security. I'm the person who prevents the wars you read about in the papers from actually happening. Marcus found his voice. This is insane. You're lying. This is some kind of... Agent Harrison stepped forward. Sir, I need to ask you to step back. Director Thompson needs to leave immediately. Director? Marcus laughed, but it sounded hollow. She can't even keep an apartment. Mom and Dad offered to pay her rent last month. That apartment is a cover, I said, gathering my things. My actual residence is classified. The car you think I drive? Registered to the State Department. The job you think I have? It doesn't exist. I started walking toward the door, Harrison and 2 other agents flanking me. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Wait! My mother ran after me, her heels clicking on the marble. Serena, please. We didn't know. How could we not know? I stopped at the door, turning back to face them one last time. You didn't know because you never asked. You never wondered why someone with a Yale degree would clean buildings. You never questioned why I could never discuss my work. You created a story that made you comfortable, the successful son and the disappointment daughter, and you chose to believe it. But we're your parents, my father said, and for the first time in my life, he looked small. Yes, I agreed. You're my parents who spent 7 years telling everyone I was a janitor because it was easier than admitting you didn't understand my life. You introduced me tonight with shame in your voice, in front of people I've protected without their knowledge, people whose children are alive because of operations I've coordinated. The room was silent except for the low hum of the SUVs idling outside. I have to go, I said. There's a situation developing that could affect millions of lives. I don't have time for this. As I walked out, I heard Mrs. Vanderbilt whisper, "The President knows her name. The President of the United States knows her name." In the SUV, Harrison handed me the classified briefing. The situation was worse than I'd thought. Chinese naval forces were moving toward Taiwan, our carriers were out of position, and the Russian president was making noise about supporting Beijing. I had maybe 6 hours to prevent a catastrophic miscalculation. My phone buzzed with texts from my parents, from Marcus, from numbers I didn't recognize, probably their friends, suddenly interested in the janitor's daughter. I turned it off and focused on the briefing. "Ma'am," Agent Harrison said quietly. "I know it's not my place, but that was necessary," I finished. They needed to know. Your brother looked like he was going to pass out. I almost smiled. Marcus, the golden child, the one they'd invested everything in, the one whose accomplishments they celebrated while apologizing for mine. He'd made partner at 32 and thought he'd conquered the world. I wondered how he felt knowing his sister had been briefing world leaders while he was filing motions. We arrived at Andrews Air Force Base in record time. The modified 747 was waiting, engines already running. As I boarded, my staff was already assembled in the mobile command center we'd installed in what used to be the upper deck lounge. Director Thompson, my deputy, James Crawford, handed me the latest intelligence. The situation's escalating. Beijing's moved up their timeline. "Get me the Joint Chiefs," I ordered. and wake up the ambassador in Beijing. We need back channels open before I land. As the plane lifted off, I looked down at the lights of DC spreading below us. Somewhere down there, my parents were probably still standing in that country club, trying to explain to their friends how their janitor daughter had just left in a Secret Service convoy to prevent World War III. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent years crafting the perfect family narrative: the successful judge, the accomplished lawyer's son, and the embarrassment they tolerated out of duty. They'd never realized that while they were building their small empire of social connections and country club memberships, I was helping to run an actual empire, the most powerful nation on earth. 6 hours later, I was in a secure facility in Beijing, facing down President Chen's senior advisors. The next 12 hours were a blur of negotiations, threats, promises, and careful diplomatic maneuvering. When it was over, the carriers had pulled back, the Chinese fleet had returned to port, and the Taiwan Strait remained open. The president called personally. "Outstanding work, Director. You've prevented a catastrophe." "Thank you, Mr. President. I heard there was some family drama before you left." "News traveled fast in DC. It's been resolved, sir." "Good. Because I need you in Moscow next week. The situation with Ukraine is deteriorating." "I'll be ready, sir." When I finally returned to DC, there were 47 messages from my parents. I listened to the first one, my mother crying, apologizing, begging me to call, and deleted the rest. Marcus had sent an email with the subject line, "I'm sorry." I opened it. It was one line. "I had no idea who you really were." "No, I thought you didn't. None of you did. Because you were too busy seeing what you wanted to see, the failure that made your success shine brighter." 2 weeks later, a package arrived at my classified mail drop. It was from my mother, photo albums from my childhood, pictures of me at Yale, newspaper clippings she'd apparently been keeping of world events, now marked with sticky notes. "Were you involved in this? Did you help stop this? Is this why you couldn't come home?" At the bottom was a handwritten note. "We failed you. We failed as parents. We were so proud of the wrong things." I kept the note but sent the albums back. Some bridges, once burned by the very people who should have protected them, couldn't be rebuilt with photo albums and regret. A month later, the Washington Post ran a profile piece. "The Ghost of the State Department: How Serena Thompson Became America's Most Powerful Unknown." They'd tried to interview my parents. The reporter noted they'd declined to comment, but neighbors reported they'd taken down all of Marcus's photos from their social media and stopped attending country club events. I didn't feel sympathy. For 7 years, they'd chosen to see me as lesser, to use my perceived failure as a conversation piece, to introduce me with shame to people who would have been awed to know what I really did. They'd made their choice every single day for 7 years. Now I had work to do. Real work. Not cleaning office buildings, but cleaning up international messes before they became catastrophes. Not serving my parents' need for a simple narrative, but serving my country's need for security and stability. The next time I saw them was on television, at a congressional hearing where I was testifying about emergency protocols. They were in the gallery, my parents looking older and smaller than I remembered. When our eyes met, my mother mouthed, "I'm proud of you." I turned back to the senators and continued my testimony. Their pride, like their shame, no longer mattered. I'd spent 7 years protecting a nation while they'd spent 7 years protecting their reputation. In the end, I hadn't needed their approval or their understanding. I'd needed what every child deserves: parents who see them for who they are, not who they want them to be. Since I couldn't have that, I'd settled for something else. The satisfaction of knowing that while they were telling everyone I was nothing, I was quietly becoming everything they'd never imagined possible. The janitor's daughter who cleaned up the world's messes, one international crisis at a time.